Hey everyone, it's Ian Heller with Distribution Strategy Group. We have a great webinar today called State of Distributor Sales, Best Practices to Compete in a Changing Market. And boy, is the market changing. I'm so excited to have Brian Gardner here today. He's the founder of Sales Process 360. He'll be joining us in a minute. Man, I tell you, there's just not a more important topic for many distributors. You think about the amount of investment and effort that goes into hiring and managing and getting the most productivity you can out of a sales force. And if you're joining us on this program, I think you're going to learn a few things about how to do that even better. So, before we get started, though, let me tell you about a couple of upcoming things. One is we have our next event, the Product and Productivity Summit. That is let's see, Chicago from November 10th to 12th at the Chicago Marriott O'Hare. This is a fantastic event. It's the second one that we've done. If you've been to any of our live events, you know the kind of rigor we put into making sure that they are as educational, as helpful as possible. We've got some fantastic topics like, quote and order automation, pricing, managing inventory and delivery optimization, data-driven decision making, workforce and sales productivity. We've got some fantastic speakers. John Wyborg, who's the CEO at Stellar Industrial, Alex Chalsofsky, everyone's favorite economist, who will be updating us on what's going on with the economy. Janet Zelenka, one of the smartest people I've ever worked with, who's been a joint CFO and CIO. So at the same time at two different companies, she's absolutely brilliant. She'll be talking about finding hidden sources of profits in your company. And Randy McLean, arguably the world's leading expert on cost to serve, which is a really important way to think about profitability in your company. Go to profitandproductivity.com to register. We hope to see you there. It's really going to be quite an event. Next, we've launched our own suite of software products called Distributor RX. There's three parts to this. One is Customer Experience RX. This is a net promoter score system, but it's very detailed. It's designed just for distributors, just like all of our software products. That means you get feedback not only on your aggregate performance, your overall performance, but your customers will rate you on your delivery performance, your customer service performance, your pricing, your inventory availability, et cetera. And you get all this by job function. You get it by location. You can sort the data any way that you want. And it really is like an MRI on your business for what customers think of your performance. You'll know exactly where to improve. And a lot of these are like small incremental improvements you can make today. It's not all strategic stuff. Employee Experience RX, this is employee engagement. So you get detailed feedback on how your employees rate you as an employer, which is ever more important in this demanding and competitive job market. And Demand RX helps you estimate sales potential by product line, by account. And this applies to either your customers or your prospects. So you understand where to focus your sales reps, where the opportunities are within your existing and prospective customers. It's a fantastic tool. These are all developed from scratch by us, by my brilliant business partner, with lots and lots of input from distributors to make sure they're just the right thing. So we're very excited to market these products. Please go to distributionstrategy.com, click on software to learn more. All right, that's it for the promos. Let's get the star of the show in here. I'm delighted to have Brian Gardner join us. Brian, I tell you, like I said earlier, this is such an incredibly important topic. And I've just been chomping at the bit to get to this program and hear what you have to say. So I'm going to turn it over to you. I will encourage the audience, please ask questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom. I'll moderate for Brian. But Brian, welcome to the program, and thanks for lending your expertise to our audience.
Well, thank you, Ian, and thanks, DSG. I mean, Ian, what you reached out to me, I don't know what, I lose track of time, 6 weeks ago, maybe, I don't know, saying, hey, would I be interested in this? And there was no thought process. It's sure I'm interested in this. This is exciting stuff for me. It's I'm no spring chicken. So, where I am in my career, any chance I get to maybe impart some knowledge or some best practices or things that I've seen in the marketplace that's what's rewarding to me right now. And so my goal here is hopefully I can do that and the audience can take away something. So no, again, thanks, and very excited to be part of this. So thank you. All right. I know we've got a time limit. I've got a lot of things to talk about, so I'm going to jump in here and let's get ready to rock and roll. So again, thanks everyone for joining. So what's my goal today? My goal today is to share some best practices that I've seen and been involved with in sales transformation over the past 25 plus years. Um, Challenge you. I view myself on this call as to maybe challenge you a little bit. I mean, I think you got on this call to learn something, right? And so I want to challenge you to think and maybe get you out of your comfort zone. We all live in our comfort zone. I get it. But I think sometimes it's good to get out of your comfort zone and look at something from a different perspective. Then I want to give you some takeaways that you can actually take back to your team. Today, tomorrow, next week, next month, at your next sales meeting, whatever. So that's my goal. Those are my 3 pillars of my goals today. So, all right, here we go. Start off with, I might ruffle some feathers, okay, on this statement. And that is, and one of the things I'm so excited about for what I'm doing in this distribution market is, I believe that distributors are lagging when it comes to sales process and technology. I really, really do. I believe it. I see it, and I've lived it. So why do I believe that? 35 plus years in distribution, industrial distribution primarily, but grew up in a family business. Worked from stock and shelves to inside sales, outside sales, sales management, ultimately VP of sales. And I'm just a big believer in sales process. I'm a big believer in team selling and ultimately improving the customer experience. So that's why I believe this. I've been involved with 200 plus sales transformations over the years. I've switched into a consulting focus now, again, in my later stage in life here to help companies, and I leverage what I've done in the past. I've got experience, and I feel what good looks like. And I really believe I can bring value. What does good look like? And also, throw a little cold water on this. This is not easy. There's no easy button. There's no easy button. There's no shortcut, so to speak, in this that I found. So anyway, here we go. So Ian, DSG did a survey in preparation for this. I put together some questions. And so I wanted to share with the audience here. And the question here was sales process. Do you feel your sales processes can support consistent and repeatable success? So however you want to look at this, half full or half empty, 90% plus felt somewhat or not very confident. Okay. 7% said very confident. So that leaves 93% not very confident. So I believe these answers support my belief that this market is can really put some focus on this that can ultimately bring value to their team, which we'll dive into. So there's
Hey,
the results.
Brian, when you work with distributors, is the root cause of this that they haven't put enough effort into it, or that they've tried, they just don't know how to do it, or some combination of both?
Combination of both. In fact, I'm going to touch on some of that. I think in
Okay.
this, I'm going to talk about what does good look like, or what I've seen as the secret sauce for success with this. And again, there's no easy button, Ian. This is not easy.
Right.
It's not easy. So, all right, here we go. So another question that was asked was, what are your top sales challenges? And you can see those. I highlighted some in red there. Finding and winning new customers. I mean, obviously from the sales pursuit side, equipping your sales team with the right tools and data, and then managing large complex product lines. These are all things that I see and work with companies and really get your arms around this. Take that first one. Finding and winning new customers. When I read that and saw that, number 2 there on the list, something that I use that I believe and what I've worked with companies on is going wider and deeper with existing customers. There's finding new customers, but there's also going wider and deeper with your product offerings and services to existing customers. And that's the easiest place to go grow your business. But a lot of companies, maybe they don't focus on that. They don't profile to the level, they're happy with, okay, we're getting these products. We're getting, $500,000 from this, or 200,000, 100,000, and we're happy. Well, could be getting double that or triple that. And again, another thing I believe is that most customers don't know the full breadth of your product, or they don't know your full breadth. And if we assume they do, shame on us. All right. Another thing here is technology adoption. Again, these were the questions that were asked. CRM, 60+% of the say, hey, we're adopting CRM. Great. So something I have done in the past when I give talks on this whole sales transformation and CRM and sales process, the question I ask is, raise your hand if you were implemented CRM. In this case, 60% of the team people would raise their hand. Then I would say, keep your hand up if you feel like you're getting the value out of it, or it's bringing what you thought it could bring to the table. How many hands went down? Most of the hands went
Yeah.
down. Maybe, and again, maybe 10-20% of the audience kept their hands up, maybe. So, and then that supports the next question that was asked. Approaches to using, we use some tools, but adoption is inconsistent across the team, 60+%. So anyway, I think this supports why I believe that this distribution market is a lagger with regards to processes and technology. It's getting your arms around this. Okay. All right. Let's get into have some fun here. What I'd like you to do is think about this for a second. What is your competitive edge? 10-second rule. Write down or think about what is your competitive edge. Okay. Shot clock is on 10 seconds. Really think about this. Remove everything else. Think about what is truly your competitive edge as a company. Right. You got that in your head, or you wrote down a couple things here. I've been doing this for a long time, asking these questions when we start rolling out or working with a client or doing a seminar like this. I ask this question. Without fail, I get these answers. See how they compare. Our people, our products, our service, our knowledge, our experience. Okay? These are the answers I typically get. Again, I know this isn't an open mic, but I'd love to see how close was that to what you wrote down or what you thought. So I asked the question, and I get again, like I said, without fail, this is the answers that I get. So the question I ask is, if you were to ask your competitor this question, what would they say?
Same thing.
Same thing. So if everyone says the same thing, what truly is your competitive edge, or what sets you apart?
Right.
And that's, I guess, if there's one message from today that you walk away with, it's that. It's like, hey, let's challenge. I want to challenge myself. I want to challenge my team on what truly is our competitive edge. Because I guarantee you, if you go back to an exercise, if you go back to your team and do at your next sales meeting, next week, next month, or whatever, ask their team this question. Have them write that down. Ask your sales team this question. See what answers you get. I guarantee you're going to get the same thing, and then challenge them on, okay, we need to think a little differently because, yeah, these are important. I believe these are just to play the game, Ian.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, it's brilliant. I completely agree, Brian. And it can't be a competitive edge if your competitors do it too.
So what is a true competitive edge? I put it into 3 pillars. We can digest 2 to 3 pillars, right? So these are the 3 pillars that I believe. And I'm going to review each one of these. Sales cycle management. Become better at sales cycle management. I'll talk about that. Plus team collaboration and information sharing. Plus a unified database, one source of the truth. I believe these 3 pillars, if you focus on these 3 pillars, I believe they can equal the missing piece for growth. It's like a piece of the puzzle. And I'm going to dive into each of these. So with that, another thing that I'm going to dive into is data is the new gold. You've heard this, you've seen this. Data is so key. I've got a slide about AI. I'm not an AI expert, but I'll touch about this. But having your data in your house in order is so important. And so anyway, we'll talk about that. All right, so let's break these down a little bit. So sales cycle management on the left. Better manage the front end of the sales cycle, ensuring leads are nurtured effectively and opportunities are managed better. Team collaboration. Empower the team to share and leverage critical customer information, leading to increased wallet share, what we just talked about, and again, a stronger customer relation, and then unified data, one source of the truth. CRM can become that 360 view of your business, allowing your team to make good business decisions. The statement, I don't have it in one of my slides, but something a client told me once, and I've used it and I've given them credit for it. Their comment was, when we went through this sales transformation, one of our main goals was to remove the feels like. Think about that. Remove the feels like. It feels like we're going to get this order. It feels like we're growing our business. It feels like we're going wider and deeper into accounts. It feels like. Well, do you have the data to back that up? And are you looking and monitoring? Okay. All right. So the real edge comes from CRM, not only for managing the data, but transforming it into an actionable insights, setting you apart in this competitive marketplace. So the takeaway from these couple slides that I challenge you on, and maybe again, take back to your team, is really analyze what you and your team feels your competitive edge is. And I believe it's not always what you think it is. It's about managing data those three pillars that I talked about: managing your data, one source of the truth, and better managing the front end of the sales cycle. So let's dive deeper into those a little bit, very high level. So I like this slide from the visual perspective of, okay, focus on the front end of the sales cycle. What I'm talking about here is there's the front end. I break the sales cycle into two major areas: the front end and the back end. CRM plays on the front end, your ERP system plays on the back end, order to cash. Okay. If we take and we embed a traditional 4-step sales cycle, you identify leads, you get leads, however you get your leads. You then need to qualify those leads to opportunities. Those opportunities then hopefully move to quotes or proposals, and then hopefully those turn to orders. And you're in the distribution business, you can sell. This whole cycle starts again for different products or services, right? The moral of the story is, I believe the critical stage is that front end of the sales cycle where CRM plays. If we believe that, then let's break this down. So here's another exercise that you can do with your team. So how do you measure up at every stage of the sales cycle? So if what you're seeing there is I linearize that sales cycle: lead to op to quote to order. Okay. And if we take this bracket here, this is kind of the front end of lead and op. I believe quotes are the back end of the front end, and the front end of the back end, depending on how you're doing them. Okay. Here's the takeaway. What I ask companies to do is, you see below the stars, 5 stars, right? Take each of those stages of the sales cycle. Start at the order stage. Can you put a 1 to 5? Can you put 1 star or 5 stars there with regards to your company's processes, procedures, visibility, standards, all of that stuff? Okay, 1 to 5. Then you move to the quote stage. Grade the standards on quotes, follow up on quote processes. Are we expanding the sale on quotes and offering additional products to expand the sale? All of those things. Then you go to the opportunity start of the sales cycle. Grade yourself and then the leads. Moral of the story: 1 to 5. Typically, I find that most companies have higher numbers, higher scores at the order stage, and as you go backwards, so to speak, in the sales cycle or the front of the sales cycle, it becomes less. And the front end is driving your growth. That's where you need to make sure you have those processes and procedures. So the story there, you see I've got down there the reminder for me, the Bayro story. I was working with a client years ago, and they were a quoting machine. They would quote everything, and they quoted a lot. They were not an order getting machine. They were not a high margin machine. Okay. They were a quoting machine. So what did we do? We analyzed that. We put in place processes to better manage leads and opportunities before it hit the quote stage. We were driving the process. We started quoting less, which might go against the grain of thought. Okay. We started quoting less, but winning more at higher margins because we focused on what we needed to focus on and what we felt we could win because we had the data and information. So again, are you driving this, or is your competitor driving this? Ian, comments? I mean, again, I love when there's interaction here. So I don't know if there's any thoughts or anything, Ian, on this.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, look, I mean, I think I love the way that you're approaching this. I think that the distributors need to be more proactive. They need to invest in technology, but they're gun shy about technology because a lot of times they haven't gotten a return on it before. And I think CRM is one in particular where we've clearly hit this tipping point where a majority of them now have a CRM. The next stage is learning how to get benefit out of it. And I think breaking this into lead, opportunity, quote, in order, and assessing, okay, how good are we overall as a company? How good are our tools? How good are our processes? I think that's exactly the right approach, is to break it down this way, and then bounce that up against the capabilities that are actually inherent in your CRM. Because as you know, and you said this earlier, most distributors are just getting a fraction of the value they could out of those tools.
Yeah, and let me just say this back to why I believe my opening slide, why I believe this, and why I truly believe this is I've lived it. So personally, I was involved with a family business. We were a family distribution company. Okay. I took on the role of VP of sales, and I said, we've got to get our arms around this front end of our business. The front end of our business is lead, opportunity, positioning ourselves when quotes, RFQs come out that we're driving it, not our competitors. So anyway, long story short, We grew our business top line growth, okay, 3x in 6.5 years with all internal growth, no acquisitions. And I will leave this earth believing that we did that because we got our arms around the front end of the sales process and we became a selling machine that was very focused, and we backed it up with data and processes. So that's why E and I believe in this so much. And again, why I like to share that with companies is to get your arms around this.
Yeah. Well, you think about how many distributors need this, process and technology improvement, and how few are on this call. I mean, we have a good audience, but I mean, if you're on this call, you're probably ahead of the curve in carrying and acting on this issue. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. All right, moving on here. Another thing to think about here with this is from silos to synergy. CRM can become that hub for this sales transformation. What I find in most companies, is that most companies work in silos: inside sales, outside management, marketing, field service, manufacturing. They're all in their silos. Each group manages maybe their database separately, or they've got their own Excel sheets over here in the G Drive, and it's silos. Okay. So think about this. I mean, again, CRM can become that hub for the sharing of leveraging information, one source of the truth, common tool, consistent processes, and again, sharing that data to make good decisions, and a better customer experience. A better customer experience. I know I'm trying not to run out of time here, but real story here, Ian, on this that I'm just thinking about as I'm showing this slide here. Worked with a client a couple years ago, and after we got up and running with the sales transformation and CRM and sales process improvements and all that we're talking about here, I'd have these coaching sessions with the sales team. And one of the things that I'm asking at every coaching session, I said, does anyone have a story of how this brought value to them or their whatever? And anyone got a story? And this lady raised her hand on the team's call and said, I do. I said, go for it. She said, I just had a customer tell me, unsolicited, tell me that the transition of me taking on their account as a sales rep was the best transition that they've ever experienced with dealing with many, many sales teams over the years.
Wow.
It's what she said during this thing. And I said, okay, let's peel that onion back. Let's break that down. So why do you think that? She said, I know why they think that. I took the ball and ran with it. I was an easy transition for them because I had the data and information that had happened and what's going on, such that I could take the ball and run with it and not starting from scratch and wasting the client's time. So that, I was like, man, this is great. Can I use this story? She said, yeah. I mean, I said, this is great. This is real world stuff here. So with that being said, what she had was this. She had data at her fingertips with her clients on all the interactions and transactions by those teams or silos. So they broke down the silos, and she had all of this at her fingertips. She could see all the activities by the inside sales or outside sales, other salespeople. They had product specialists. They were a pretty complex organization. Okay. She could see the opportunities, the leads, the service calls. She could see the quotes out of the CPQs. She could see the orders out of the ERP. She could see all the contacts. Her inside salespeople were adding contacts to the database, and she could see them. So she could now take the ball and run with it. Everything was all organized. That's team collaboration and sharing of information. Okay, moving on here. So why? Why do we do this? I think it first should start at the customer experience. This is a better customer experience. And I always ask this question. CRM stands for what? Customer Relationship Management. So when I ask that question, I say, what does customer mean? Everyone goes to the same thing. Our customers, who's buying from us? The Exxons, the Dows, the ABC Chemicals, the ABC Supply, whatever. Okay, well, I said, that's great. Yeah, but there's also internal customers, and this can be a part of that internal customer for sharing and leveraging between the inside, outside sales, marketing, and everyone is customers to each other. Consistent, streamlined customer engagement and increased customer loyalty. Operational efficiency, improve efficiency as a team, increase speed and velocity, competitive edge, and increase margin. I go back to that Bayros story that they were a quoting machine. They were also their margins were down, because they were giving everything away. They weren't driving it. I go back to my life prior when a salesperson would come up to me as VP of sales, said, hey, we need to give another 10% discount. I'm like, well, why? Why do we need to give another 10% discount? Well, and if they didn't have a true story or they're shooting from the hip because they weren't driving the process, Come on, no. We got to drive the process so that we can maybe not have to give away those margins because we're working with the users on why our product and solutions bring value.
Hey, Brian, we have a question from the audience. Um,
Yeah. I
Robin
love
wants
it.
to, yeah, Robin wants to know, can you be specific about product related needs and what is recorded and where and how?
Product specific needs.
Yeah.
Okay. If I want to make sure I understand the question or where the question is coming from, that's a when I think of product in this world of distribution, I think of the product taxonomies and the hierarchies of manufacturer and products that you're selling.
I think what Robin wants to know is when you're sort of recording what the customer's product related needs are,
Okay.
what are you
Well,
recording and where are you putting it?
yeah. Well, this is the thing that I run across all the time with companies is getting our product taxonomy in order so we can slice and dice and see where our gaps are and white space is. So creating the product needs. Example, we've got widget one, widget two, widget three of the products we sell. Are we breaking it down to that level? How granular you're getting so you can see if they're buying widget one, then why aren't they buying widget two? And you build that relationship between those products, right? And so tracking that interaction is important. It's important at the lead stage. What this lead is for what product? Okay. And that product is for what solution? I mean, I haven't talked about that, but I'm a big believer in tracking applications or solutions for your product so we can cross reference that. Right. So we're not just selling a product, we're selling a product to solve a problem. So the question is, are you tracking that? And again, CRM allows you to do that if we build it properly, if you build it properly. Um, don't know if I answered the question. I mean, to the level that we're asking. I mean, my takeaway from that, Ian, is get your arms around the granularity of the products and applications and solutions that you want to track and monitor so you can share and leverage that.
Yeah. So let me just add something to that. So you said something earlier that I preach all the time, which is that your customers don't know what you sell. And I mean, we know what we sell so well that we project that onto our customers, but they really have no idea. Okay. Um, and so there's often this opportunity to sell them products, and we don't know it because we assume that they would come to us if because we think they know we have it. And so I think in a CRM, in a good CRM, particularly these new ones when they're AI enabled, it'll suggest certain products, right? Our,
Yes,
our
yes,
tool,
yes.
our tool Demand RX reveals a lot of those opportunities as well. By the way, he said self-servingly. But I think the question is, if let's say that I've taken on a new account, and I'm meeting with them and I'm asking them about their product, about their what they, what do you buy, right? Where do I put that information? Are those notes in a CRM? Are
Yeah,
those
okay. Quick. So if that data is probably, and that doesn't probably, it resides in their ERP system, depending on the level of taxonomy from SKUs up to product family or up to manufacturer in their ERP system. So they should have that data. Now the question is, how do we use that data? What I've done in CRM systems is I've built this white space or gap white space table by
yeah,
product. And we build those in and we can now look at where the white space is. And then there's another factor on that, and that's called the demand. Meaning, do we know that they're buying $50,000 worth of this product? Okay, I got that data. Real question is that market at their facility, is it worth $100,000 or $250,000? You know,
right,
what are we
right,
getting? Are we only getting 20% of that? This is the data and information that CRM can start organizing for you such that you can see the forest through the trees and where the gaps are.
right.
And then you start taking rifle shots at where you're going to go to grow your business. Is it worth your time to go to that market or that product to grow the business? Does that make
Got it.
sense?
Yeah,
That's that. I mean, Ian, that's typically what I find with clients on that. That's fun stuff for me. Okay. But that's typically not phase one. We've got to get our house in order with the data lineup and all the segmentations, which I'll talk about with AI stuff in a minute. But that right there, Ian, is a topic that I get pretty passionate about because that
yeah.
becomes very laser focused on where you're going to go and where you're going to go to grow your business. Okay. Again, data center, one source of truth, 360 view, data at your fingertips, increase sales, and again, the data is the new gold. All right, moving on here. So, with all that being said, I opened up with why I believe, from my past history, and why I believe the distribution market is lagger. I go back to this slide. This is in CRM's wheelhouse. is get our arms around these processes, get our arms around this data and information so we can make these good decisions. Okay, let's dive deeper here. So where should you start? All right, Brian, I'm buying this. I'm ready to. Okay, I'm buying this, but okay, man, it's daunting. Where do I start? Where do I go with this? So let me give you just a high level here. First off, I think you need to identify a sales excellence manager, or what I call a CEO for CRM. Okay, someone that's going to drive this sales transformation and be the owner of the processes, the procedures, and promoting the why. So important. I could have a whole webinar session just on this, the importance of this and the steps for that. So, ask yourself the question, if on this call, ask yourself the question, do we have a sales excellence manager or CEO for CRM or someone that's driving this sales transformation? Now, again, I might ruffle some feathers here. I believe that that person should be in the sales management or have sales background and sales management experience. I see a lot of companies in the past, maybe not as much today, but definitely in the past, that have put operations or IT over this. Okay. They need to be involved, but I don't believe they should be driving this. It needs to be someone in sales management driving this. So that's just my personal opinion. Next, you assemble a team of stakeholders for each role to become part of this journey. They're going to be your evangelists. They're going to be the people out there that's promoting this. Get this, some of those stakeholders. Then I believe you need to do an audit or some assessment, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Okay. You need to then determine after you go through this with your stakeholders and figure out what you should focus on for the sales transformation. Determine the areas you're going to focus on, and the technology improvements basically becomes your roadmap, and then ultimately execute. Executing is hard. Why is this hard? Ian, you'd asked the question earlier. Why is this hard? Because companies get to a certain point and then they don't execute like they should. They revert back to their old habits. This is hard. All right, so let's dive into this one, the audit. This again could be a separate topic just on this audit. It's big and it's important, I believe. And that is, what do we do here? What are we going to focus on for the sales transformation? It's like a doctor, right? What are we going to focus on? Where are the pain points? Are we using the feels like? I mentioned that feels like earlier, right? Are we using the feels like on what we're going to focus on? Or do we have a systematic approach to this? This needs to become your roadmap. So what do you do here? You assemble a cross-functional team by roles and tenure. What I mean by tenure is someone that's only been in sales or with your company for a year to two has a different opinion and all than someone that's been there for 10 to 15, 20 years, right? And so their viewpoints are different, which is healthy during this process. So roles and tenure, different. Have the team document what they feel are the gaps and inefficiencies that are preventing growth, okay? Consider when you're going through these gaps and inefficiencies, which I'll show you the output here in a second, you're going to review the sales process. Remember the sales process steps, right? Lead, opt, to quote, order. Analyze each one of those and determine where the gaps and inefficiencies are with those. Okay? Document that. Then you look at it from the team collaboration side and workflows. Inside sales, outside sales. So you look at, as a team, where are the gaps between our communication and workflows between how our inside and outside work together? How does outside work with marketing? How does management work with whatever? How does all these different roles, you have all those different roles that interact. Document where the workflows and gaps are. All right, Brian, you say, okay, man, that sounds like a lot to do. Yeah, again, it's not easy, right? But they're systematic. It just doesn't have to be too hard. So you list the gaps, which I'm going to show you an output of an example of this. But then you do two things. You grade them by difficulty to fix that gap, L, M, or H, low, medium, or high. And if you fix that gap, what's the impact to growth, low, medium, or high? You with me, everyone, hopefully on this. What are we focusing on? The low-hanging fruit, the LHs. So here's an example of what you could do with this. And again, you can take this and do this yourself if you want. Take and have your team do this. And so here is an example of maybe some of the gaps or inefficiencies that came out from the outside sales role or the inside sales role, and then lead to opportunity management. So you take those gaps, you document those gaps. The team documents those gaps. That's the beauty of this. This isn't you doing it. This is your team telling you what they feel. And then you grade them as difficulty and impact. And you come up with a matrix of is it an LH, an LM, an LL, an HH. This isn't rocket science, Ian. It's just, but it's systematic and it removes the feels like, and it allows you to then ultimately have a roadmap to what you need to focus on, and you're not overwhelmed. I typically call it the one hand rule. Pick about 5 things, no more than 5 things you're going to focus on in phases of this transformation. Don't overwhelm. You've got the roadmap with the audit. Once you finish the LHs, move on to the LMs. Okay. How are we doing on time? Okay, I'm just checking myself here.
We're doing fine.
I get rolling here, Ian, and I lose track of time.
You're doing great.
All right. Again, I wish we had an open mic. Are there any questions by anyone that you see, Ian, or whatever? I'll stop here for a second.
We're good right now. We're good right now.
Okay. All right, here we go. So keys to success. CRM. So CRM, remember we said earlier, CRM stands for what? Customer Relationship Management. I also believe it stands for change management. I haven't found a good R in this 3-letter acronym. It's change management is what this is. And again, it's hard, So what are the things for success? Establishes as a process mindset. CRM is an engine. It's not just an IT project. We talked about that a second ago. Engage your team early. Get your key stakeholders involved early. Leave no one behind. Get them involved. Don't let them show up on a Monday morning and say, hey, we've come up with this whole new CRM and sales transformation and process improvement program. And they're hearing about it for the first time on Monday morning. No. Get them involved early in this engagement via the audit or some assessment. Okay. Phase rollout. I talked about that. Start slow and grow. Scale this thing. Okay. Train and communicate. Set the expectations. It's so important to do. I don't know if I have it in this slide. Maybe I do. I don't know. But I say this all the time. You need to set the expectations by role of what the sales transformation looks like and best practices. You need to train not only on the how, but the why. I think the why is so important, and it's not a one and done. And then you need to monitor and show the team how they can monitor themselves on how they're doing with regards to this. Okay, and then have management stay involved here.
Okay. Hey, just so you know, we have a suggestion from the audience for the R.
Yeah, go ahead.
Change reality management.
Let me write that down.
Yeah, and another one is change results management.
I love it. Yeah, I've been looking for the right R in this because again, I really believe it's change management at the end of the day. It's changing the culture, it's changing the philosophy, it's changing the process, it's changing the focus.
Let me ask you this, Brian. My guess is even people who have been, this isn't just for companies who are put in a CRM for the first time. This is for any company that feels like they're not getting what they should be getting out of the CRM, right?
So Ian, I'll answer the question this way. Over the years, I've been involved in working with clients and all, probably safely to say, not politically, but safely to say probably 50% of the clients that I've worked with are on a CRM 2.0 or CRM 3.0 project. Why they call it a 2.0 or 3.0? Because it's their second or third attempt at this.
Right.
And so just because you're on CRM now doesn't prevent you from doing the things we're talking about here.
Right.
Do a relaunch, do a re-engagement, do whatever to make sure that you're back on track.
Honestly, this is the kind of thing you probably should do every few years just as an exercise. There's a reason you call it an audit, right? An audit's something you do for an existing process. You're fading out. Go ahead, Brian. You're fading out. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's kind of fading out, but keep going.
I'm sorry. What I tell companies all the time is this is a journey. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's going phases of this. All right. Hopefully you don't lose me here.
No, you.
So AI. Obviously, it's a shiny new toy, and I get it. But I want to be very clear. I am not an expert on AI. I'm not. Okay. Now, what I believe and what I've heard, I'll talk about here, and that is you need to have your house in order with your data before you start this. Data is so key. Data is the new goal, right? So when I talk about data, some high-level things that I've worked with clients on when we go down this journey or we look at this journey is accounts, getting your bill tos and sold tos and sites and all of that organized properly, Account segmentation, making sure your accounts are segmented by however you want to slice and dice them, by industry, by market size, by market potential, whatever. And then get your manufacturer and product taxonomies, which I kind of alluded to earlier on that question. Get that in order so we can slice and dice where we're going and what we're doing to who. Here's a good example of this. See, and I just finished working with a client who had no CRM system. In fact, I have a testimonial from them at the end of this. They had no CRM system to speak of. They had these islands of, smart sheets floating around. Sizable company, multi-million-dollar company. They had an old legacy SAP ERP system. Anyway, long story short, they said we're going to roll out CRM, and we went through the whole process. They went through the whole journey of the audit and the stakeholders and all that stuff. And we looked at, okay, now we're building up the CRM. They wanted to look at bringing in all the data from SAP's ERP into CRM. I said, time out. No, let's look at that. Long story short, that data it just wasn't set up and organized for CRM. We went from 28,000 counts in their ERP down to 2,800 or so, less than 3,000 in CRM, for which we're going to drive our transactions and our team is going to focus on. And that's truly where the sites are and all that. But that was a major exercise, Ian, a major exercise. Okay. So, Ian, I went to the DSG Applied AI conference, which, by the way, was very good, very well organized, very good speakers.
Thank you.
Again, not an expert, but I'm trying to educate myself on this, right? The takeaways for me were accurate data is key, and just start with something. Start with something. Jump into this. It could be for collections. It seemed like a lot of people were doing, maybe looking at analyzing collections with AI or quote follow-up. Another one is you kind of mentioned it earlier, Ian, serve up information to your sales team. Use AI to give feedback on pricing assistance and product offerings and personal intel on those contacts. Hey, did you know that, on Facebook or LinkedIn that this person just had this certification or just finished this class? I mean, use that data, right? That information. But the thing I walked away, Ian, from that conference was, exciting times ahead, a little scary, but exciting. Okay. Data is king, and just start somewhere.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to add to that, because again, you obviously were running that.
I would say another takeaway is there are distributors who have already jumped in, and they are building competitive. I mean, there are distributors out there who have put in these like quote automation tools, and they're quoting everything that comes in, stuff that a greater number of quotes that they've ever been able to respond to before, faster than ever, and they're winning more of them. That's going to become a table stakes technology, and it's almost there now. And AI enabled CRMs are, with more predictive stuff in them and giving you recommended actions to take, et cetera. I mean, this stuff's happening now. If you're not doing it, you're falling behind. And so, yeah, get started, but you're behind the leaders already.
Moving on here. So what are the key takeaways? If I'm saying myself to you, the audience on the call here, what are the takeaways? I believe you must have a CEO for CRM or a sales excellence manager that's driving this transformation and this process improvement and technology advance. Just someone that's driving this from the sales management side. Do an audit or some assessment with your key stakeholders. Get your arms around what they're thinking and their involvement now in this in the beginning. Sign off on a roadmap for what the team will focus on. And then execute, start. Kind of like the AI, just start. But have a roadmap. Don't remove the feels like. Have a roadmap that comes from this auditor assessment is, I think, key to this, to get your arms around this. All right, so your competitive edge, back to one of my opening slides. What's your competitive edge? I believe it's your data and it's your team collaboration, and CRM plays in the middle there. So use the data and collaboration as that competitive edge. Embrace CRM for what it is. It's not just technology; it's how you use it. Okay. I'm asked this question a lot, and so I put this in here, kind of the last minute. Ian, sorry, I was looking at preparing and got excited. I said, you know what? I was looking at something, and it just got off of. I was out and about doing some. Anyway, I thought about this, and I said, you know what? Let me show this here. So this is for everyone. Again, when you're asked by yourself or by your team, okay, I'm on the bus. I'm on the bus. I want to make change. I want to focus on this. I believe this can give me a competitive edge. But what's in it for me? Everyone's going to say, what's in it for me? I hear that all the time from inside and outside sales. What's in it for me? Here's a list of 10 things that I believe are what's in it for you, so to speak. Improve the external customer experience. I'm not going to read through those. You guys can read through it for time. And I'm sure you'll get this part of your presentation. So this is what's in it for them. And this is what I promote with clients or have them think about and promote the why. Back to my statement earlier about train on not just the how, but the why. Why are we doing this sales transformation? Okay. So summary. So back to what's the title of this? Was this best practice to compete in a changing market? Focus on improving your sales processes, that front end of the sales cycle. Do that audit for front end, making sure you got your processes which is driving growth. That's the missing piece for growth. That's where you're going to grow your business, is putting better processes at the front end. Share and leverage data across the team selling, and a better customer experience. Everyone needs to feel like they're getting something back, not just input, but output. That's a big one. That's something big that, again, you've got to position this as a team solution, and everyone needs to feel like they're getting something back versus just inputting into the system, into the process. Get your data in order. The segmentations, the hierarchies, your taxonomies for AI, it's needed. And then set the expectations, train on the how and the why, and then train your team on how to monitor those expectations. So, Ian, that's kind of my story, and I'm sticking to it. I'm going to share something here in a second that we'll read through, but let me share that, and then I'll come back. I'll stop here and just end this thing here. So, this was, again, I questioned this, but I said this might be good. This was this is a testimonial. Actually, I'm working on a white paper case study on this from a client that I just finished going through this transformation. And I'll let you read this. In just 9 months, the CRM initiative has found, and I'll let you guys read it. Let me just let you guys read it.
Yeah, this is really a much more comprehensive view of CRM than what it was in the past, isn't it, Brian?
Yeah. So then he said, we're poised to unlock even greater value of our customers and internal support team. Choosing to invest in the power of this properly built CRM is less about buying the software solution, but more about changing the way we're going to approach our company, life of our company. So this was a testimonial on this whole change. Was it easy? No. And he'll tell you that. His name is Monty Pearson, VP of Vincent Process Controls. This was in June this year. Was this easy? No. But going through this journey, again, they feel like they're setting themselves up for success and a competitive edge. So I thought I would just share that, Ian. This was hot off the press. And so with that being said, Ian, I thank you so much for allowing me to share what again, something I get excited about this, and hopefully I challenged the team a little, the audience a little bit, got you thinking. Hope you feel like this was time well spent. Your takeaways, have your team grade, do that audit, do a self-assessment, analyze how you rank your sales processes. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, or, post a lot of white papers and stuff out there. But again, I truly thank you for your time, and Ian, thank you for allowing me to share my experience.
Hey, Brian, in your email address, should there be 2 S's for process there?
Yeah, there should be.
Okay. Yeah. Just to, so if it's Brian, it's Brian.Gardner at salesprocess360.com.
How did I miss that? Sorry.
That's all right. Don't worry about it. Okay, great. That's awesome. So, let me, why don't you stop sharing there for a minute, and, I'm going to just tell you about a couple of upcoming events. Please, everybody, hold on for just a minute. So we have a technology leader panel. We've got John Murcott, who's the EVP of Products and Strategy for Hawk Search by Bridgeline, and Sam Bobb, who's the co-founder and chief technologist of Cavio, who are talking about creating clean and accurate product and customer data. What a topical follow-up topic to what we just were, what you were just teaching us, Brian. So this is August 13th, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific time. You're not going to want to miss this. It's brought to you by Hawk Search by Bridgeline and Cavio. Then last thing we'll cover today is on August 20th, we have Elevating the B2B Customer Experience. It's an episode of Wholesale Change, which is our regular webcast and podcast. Justin Racine, who's a principal at Unified Commerce, principal of Unified Commerce Strategy at Proficient, brought to you by Epicor. So these will be good. We're looking forward to them. But today, Brian, it's been all about you and your fantastic work. I sure learned a lot. I think everybody else did too. Thanks so much for bringing us this content.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Go out there, sell smarter, sell better. Use your CRM to create new types of competitive advantage. And Brian, we'll talk to you soon, my friend. Bye now.
All right. Bye-bye.